Hello, I'm back. It's me again. Here to read you Chapter 2 of Neverwhere by Neil Gaiman. Published in this edition by Headline. I think you get different editions, but Headline's published this one. And thanks again for permission to read it to you. I am not a professional reader. I'm a professional primary school teacher. You can probably get a better deal anywhere else. I believe if you go to Audible, you can hear Neil Gaiman himself read it to you. But I am available and I am free, and I'm here to read it to you as long as there's anyone to listen. So, Chapter 2, ladies and gentlemen. Chapter 2. He is somewhere deep beneath the ground. In a tunnel, perhaps. Or in a sewer. Light comes in flickers, defining the darkness, not dispelling it. He is not alone. There are other people walking beside him, although he cannot see their faces. They're running now, through the inside of the sewer, splashing through the mud and filth. Droplets of water fall slowly through the air, crystal clear in the darkness. He turns a corner and the beast is waiting for him. It is huge. It fills the space of the sewer, massive head down, bristled body and breath steaming in the chill of the air. Some kind of boar, he thinks at first, and then realises that must be nonsense. No boar could be so huge. It's the size of a bull or a tiger or of a car. It stares at him, and it pauses for 100 years while he lifts his spear. He glances at his hand, holding the spear, and observes that it is not his hand. The arm is furred with dark hair. The nails are almost claws, and then the beast charges. He throws his spear, but it is already too late, and he feels the beast slice his side with razor-sharp tusks, feels his life slip away into the mud, and realises that he has fallen face down into the water, which crimsons in thick swirls of suffocating blood, and he tries to scream, he tries to wake up, but he can breathe only mud and blood and water, and he can feel only pain. "Bad dream?" asked the girl. Richard sat up on the couch, gasping for breath. The curtains were still drawn. The lights, television still on, but he could tell from the pale light coming in through the cracks that it was morning. See, in a professional recording, they'd take out the coughs, wouldn't they? He fumbled on the couch for the remote control, which had wedged itself into the small of his back during the night, turned off the television. "Yes," he said. "Sort of." He wiped away the sleep grit that crusted his eyes and took stock of himself, pleased to notice that he had at least taken off his shoes and jacket before he'd fallen asleep. His shirt front was covered with dried blood and dirt. The homeless girl didn't say anything. She looked bad, pale beneath the grime and the brown dried blood, and small. She was dressed in a variety of clothes thrown over each other, odd clothes, dirty velvets, muddy lace, rips and holes through which other layers and styles could be seen. She looked, Richard thought, as if she'd done a midnight raid on the history of fashion section of the Victoria and Albert Museum and was still wearing everything she'd taken. Her short hair was filthy, but looked like it might have been a dark reddish colour under the dirt. If there was one thing Richard hated, it was people who stated the obvious. The kind of people who come up to him and say things he was incapable of failing to notice for himself, such as, "It's raining," or "The bottom just dropped out of your shopping bag and your food just fell into that puddle," or even, "Oh, I bet that hurts." "You're up then," said Richard, and hated himself. "Whose barony is this?" asked the girl. "Whose fiefdom?" "Sorry?" She looked around her suspiciously. "Where am I?" "Flat 4, Newton Mansions, Little Comdon Street." He stopped. She'd opened the curtains, blinking at the cold daylight. The girl stared out at the rather ordinary view from Richard's window, astonished, peering wide-eyed at the cars, at the buses and the tiny sprawl of shops and newsagents, and bakers, and chemists, and off-licence below them. "I'm in London above," she said, in a small voice. "Yes, you're in London," said Richard. "Above what?" he wondered. "I think maybe you were in shock or something last night. That was a nasty cut on your arm." He waited for her to say something. to explain. She glanced at him and then looked back down at the buses and the shops. Richard continued, I found you on the pavement. There was rather a lot of blood. Don't worry, she said seriously. Most of the blood was someone else's. She let the curtain fall back and then she began to unwrap the scarf, now blood-stained and crusted, from her arm. She examined the cut, made a face. We're going to have to do something about this, she said. Do you want to give me a hand? Richard was beginning to feel a little out of his depth. I don't really know too much about first aid, he said. Well, she said, if you're really squeamish, you only have to hold the bandages and tie the bits I can't reach. You do have bandages, don't you? Richard nodded. Oh, yes, he said, in the first aid box, in the bathroom, under the sink. And then he went to his bedroom and he changed his clothes. He wondered whether the mess on his shirt, his best shirt, bought for him by, oh God, Jessica, she would have kittens, would ever come off. The bloody water reminded him of something, some kind of dream he'd once had, perhaps, but he could no longer for the life of him remember what. He pulled the plug, let the water out of the sink and filled it with clean water again, to which he added a cloudy splash of Dettol. The sharp antiseptic smell seemed so utterly sensible and medicinal, a remedy for the oddness of his situation and his visitor. The girl leaned over the sink and he splashed warm water over her arm and shoulder. Richard was never as squeamish as he thought he was, or rather, he was astonishingly squeamish when it came to blood on screen. A good zombie movie or even an explicit medical drama would leave him huddled in a corner, hyperventilating, with his hands over his ears, muttering things like, just tell me when it's over. But when it came to real blood, real pain, he simply got on and did something about it. They cleaned out the cut, which was much less severe than Richard remembered it from the night before. They bandaged it up, and the girl did her very best not to wince in the process. And Richard found himself wondering how old she was, what she looked like under the grime, and why she was living on the streets, and what's your name? He asked. Sorry, what's your name? She asked. Richard Mayhew. Dick. She nodded as if she were committing it to memory. The doorbell rang. Richard looked at the mess in the bathroom, and the girl wondered how it would look to a sensible outside observer, such as example. Oh, law, he said, realising the worst. I bet it's Jess. She's going to kill me. Damage control. Look, he said to the girl, you wait in here. He shut the door on the bathroom behind him and he walked down the hall. He opened the front door and breathed a huge and quite heartfelt sigh of relief. It wasn't Jessica. It was, what? Mormons? Jehovah's Witnesses? The police? He couldn't tell. There were two of them at any rate. They wore black suits, which were slightly greasy, slightly afraid, and even Richard, who counted himself among the sartorially dyslexic, felt there was something odd about the cut of the coats. They were the kind of suits that might have been made by a tailor 200 years ago who had had a modern suit described to him but never actually seen one. The lines were wrong, so were the grace notes. A fox and a wolf, thought Richard, involuntarily. The man in front, the fox, was a little shorter than Richard. He had lank, greasy hair of an unlikely orange colour and a pallid complexion, and as Richard opened the door, he smiled widely, just a fraction too late, with teeth that looked like an accident in a graveyard. A good morrow to you, good sir, he said, on this fine and beautiful day. Hello, said Richard. We are conducting a personal inquiry of a delicate nature, as it were, door to door. Do you mind if we come in? Well, it's not very convenient right now, said Richard. Then he asked, are you with the police? The second of the visitors, a tall man, the one he'd thought of as a wolf, his grey and black hair cut bristles short, stood a little behind his friend, holding a stack of photocopies to his chest. He'd said nothing until now, just waited, huge and impassive, and now he laughed once, low and dirty. There was something unhealthy about that laugh. The police, alas, said the smaller man, we cannot claim that felicity. A career in law and order, though indubitably enticing, was not inscribed on the cards of Dame Fortuna dealt my brother and me. No, we are merely private citizens. Allow me to make Introductions, I am Mr. Croup, and this gentleman is my brother, Mr. Vandermeer. They did not look like brothers. They did not look like anything that Richard had seen before. Your brother? Asked Richard. Shouldn't you have the same name? I'm impressed. What a brain. Mr. Vandermeer, keen and incisive isn't the half of it. Some of us are so sharp, he said as he leaned in closer to Richard, went up on tiptoes into Richard's face. We could just cut ourselves. Richard took an involuntary step backwards. Can we come inside? Asked Mr. Croup. What do you want? Mr. Croup sighed in what he obviously imagined was a rather wistful manner. We're looking for our sister, he explained, a wayward child, wilful and headstrong, who has close to broken our poor dear widowed mother's heart. Ran away, explained Mr. Vandermeer quietly, and he thrust a photocopied sheet into Richard's hands. She's a little funny, he added, and then he twirled one finger next to his temple to indicate the girl was in fact a complete lunatic. Richard looked down at the paper. It said, Have you seen this girl? Beneath it was a photocopy grey photograph of a girl who looked to Richard rather like a tidier, cleaner, longer-haired version of the young lady that he had left in his bathroom. Under that it said, Answers to the name of Doreen. Bites and kicks. Run away. Tell us if you saw her. Want her back. Reward paid. And below that, a telephone number. Richard looked back at the photograph. It was definitely the girl in the bathroom. No, he said, I haven't seen her. I'm afraid. I'm sorry. Mr. Vandermeer, however, was not listening. He had raised his head. He was sniffing the air, like a man smelling something old and unpleasant. Richard reached out to give him back his piece of paper. The man simply pushed past him and walked into the flat, a wolf on the prowl. Richard ran after him. What do you think you're doing? Will you stop that? Get out. Look, you can't go in there, because Mr. Vandermeer was headed straight for the bathroom. Richard hoped that the girl, Doreen, had the presence of mind to lock the bathroom door, but no, it swung open at Mr. Vandermeer's push. He walked in, and Richard, feeling like a small and ineffectual dog yapping at the heels of a postman, followed him in. It was not a large bathroom. It contained a bath, a toilet, a sink, several bottles of shampoo, a bar of soap and a towel. When Richard had left it, just a couple of minutes before, it had also contained a rather dirty, bloody girl, a very bloody sink, and an open first aid kit, and now it was gleamingly tidy. There was nowhere that the girl could have been hiding. Mr. Vandermeer walked out of the bathroom, pushed open Richard's bedroom door, walked in, looked around. I don't know what you think you're doing, said Richard, but if you two don't get out of my flat this minute, I'm phoning the police. Then Mr. Vandermeer, who'd been in the process of examining Richard's tight living room, turned back towards Richard, and Richard suddenly realised he was very, very scared. Like a small dog who just discovered what he had thought to be a postman was in fact an enormous dog-eating alien from the kind of film that Jessica had no time for. Richard found himself wondering whether Mr. Vandermeer was the kind of person to whom you said, "Don't hurt me," and if he was, whether that would do any good. And then foxy Mr. Croup said, "Why, yes, whatever can have come over you, Mr. Vandermeer? It's a grief for our dear sweet sibling. Our wager has turned his head. Now, apologise to the gentleman, Mr. Vandermeer." Mr. Vandermeer nodded. He pondered for a moment. "Thought I needed to use the toilet," he said. "Didn't. Sorry." Mr. Croup began to walk down the hall, pushing Mr. Vandermeer in front of him. "There, now you'll forgive my errant brother his lack of social graces, I trust. Worry over our poor, dear widowed mother, and over our sister, whom even as we speak is wandering the streets of London, unloved and uncared for, has nigh unhinged him, I'll be bound. But for all that, he's a good fellow to have at your side. He's not so stout fellow." And they were out of Richard's flat now, into the stairwell. Mr. Vandermeer said nothing. He did not look nigh unhinged with grief. Croup turned back to Richard and essayed another foxy smile. "You will tell us if you see her," he said. "Goodbye," said Richard, and he closed the door and locked it, and for the first time since he'd lived there he attached the security chain. "I'm not fat," said Mr. Vandermeer. Mr. Croup, who had cut Richard's phone line at the first mention of calling the police, and was starting to wonder whether he'd cut the right cord or not, 20th century telecommunications technology not being his strongest point, took a handbill from Mr. Vandermeer. "I never said you were," he said. "Spit!" Mr. Vandermeer hawked a mouthful of phlegm from the back of his throat and spat it angrily on the back of the handbill. Mr. Croup slapped the handbill hard onto the wall next to Richard's door. It immediately stuck, and stuck hard. "Have you seen this girl?" it asked. "Said stout fellow means fat. Stout also means strong, sound, sturdy, staunch, lusty, vigorous, brave, resolute and intrepid," said Mr. Croup. "Do you believe him?" They turned back down the stairs. "Do I buggery," said Mr. Vandermeer. "I could smell her." Richard waited by his front door until he heard the main door slam several floors below. He was walking down the hallway back towards the bathroom when the phone rang loudly, startling him. He sprinted back down the hall, picked up the handpiece. "Hello," said Richard. "Hello." No sound came out of the handpiece. Instead there was a click, and Jessica's voice came out of the answer machine on the table next to the phone. Her voice said, "Richard, this is Jessica. I'm sorry you're not there, because this would have been our last conversation, and I did so want to tell you this to your face." The phone, he realised, was completely dead. The handpiece trailed a foot or so of cord and was neatly cut off. He shouted into it anyway, saying things like, "Jessica," and "I am here," and "Please don't hang up." "You embarrassed me very deeply last night, Richard," the voice continued. "As far as I'm concerned, our engagement is at an end. I have no intention of returning the ring, nor indeed of ever seeing you again. I trust you and your lame duck will rot in hell. Bye-bye." "Jessica!" shouted Richard, hoping perhaps by sheer volume to penetrate the telecommunications network. The tape stopped turning. There was another click, and the little red light began to flash. "Bad news?" asked the girl. She was standing just behind him in the mini kitchen part of the flat, with her arm neatly bandaged. She was getting out tea bags, putting them in mugs. The kettle was boiling. "Yes," said Richard. "Very bad." He walked over to her, handed her the "Have you seen this girl?" poster. "That's you, isn't it?" She raised an eyebrow. "The photograph's me. And you are Doreen?" She shook her head. "I'm Dor. Richard Mayhew Hick. Milk and sugar?" Richard was feeling utterly out of his depth by now. He said, "Richard. It's just Richard. No sugar." Then he said, "Look, if it isn't a personal question, what happened to you?" Dor poured the boiling water into the mugs. "You don't want to know," she said simply. "Oh, well, I'm sorry if I—" "No, Richard, honestly, you don't want to know. It wouldn't do you any good. You've done more than you should have already." She removed the tea bags, handed him a mug of tea. He took it from her, realised he was still carrying around the telephone handset. "Well, I mean, I couldn't have just left you there." "You could have," she said, "but you didn't." She pressed herself up against the wall, peered out of the window. Richard walked over to the window and looked out. Across the street, Mr. Croup and Mr. Vandermeer were coming out of the newsagent's, and "Have you seen this girl?" was stuck in a place of prominence in the newsagent's window. "Are they really your brothers?" he asked. "Please," said Dora, unimpressed. "Give me a break." He sipped his tea and tried to pretend that everything was normal. "So where were you?" he asked. "Just now?" "I was here," she said. "Look, with those two still around, we have to get a message to—" She paused. "To someone who can help? I don't dare leave here." "Well, I mean, isn't there somewhere else you could go? Someone we could phone?" She took the dead handset from his hand, cut wire trailing, and shook her head. "My friends aren't on the telephone," she said. She put the phone back in its cradle, where it sat, useless and lonely. And then she smiled, fast and wicked. "Breadcrumbs," she said. "Sorry," said Richard. There was a little window in the back of the bedroom that looked out on an area of roof tiles and gutters. Dor stood on Richard's bed to reach it. She opened the window and sprinkled the breadcrumbs around. "But I don't understand," said Richard. "No, of course you don't," she agreed. "Now, shh." There was a flutter of wings and the purple-grey sheen of a pigeon It pecked at the breadcrumbs. Dor reached out her right hand and picked it up. It looked at her curiously, but it made no complaint. They sat down on the bed. Dor got Richard to hold the pigeon, while she attached a message to its leg using a vivid blue rubber band that Richard had previously used to keep his electricity bills all in one place. Richard was not an enthusiastic holder of pigeons, even at the best of times. "I don't see the point in this," he explained. "I mean, it's not a homing pigeon, it's just a normal London pigeon. It's the kind that craps on Lord Nelson." "That's right," said Dor. Her cheek was grazed, and her dirty reddish hair was tangled but not matted, and her eyes... Richard realised he could not tell what colour her eyes were. They were not blue, they were not green, nor brown, nor grey. They reminded him of fire opals. There were burning greens and blues and even reds and yellows that vanished and glinted as she moved. She took the bird from him gently, held it up, looked it in the face. It tipped its head on one side and stared back at her with bead-black eyes. "Okay," she said. Then she made a noise that sounded like the liquid burbling of pigeons. "Okay? You're looking for the Marquis of Carabas. You got that?" The pigeon burbled liquidly back at her. "At a girl. Now this is important, so you'd better..." And the pigeon interrupted her with a rather impatient-sounding burble. "I'm sorry," said Dor. "You know what you're doing, of course." She took the bird to the window, and she let it go. Richard had watched the whole routine with some amazement. "Do you know, it almost sounded as if it understood you," he said, as the bird shrank in the sky and vanished behind some rooftops. "How about that?" said Dor. "Now we wait." She went over to the bookshelf in the corner of the bedroom. She found a copy of Mansfield Park Richard had not previously known he possessed, went into the living room. Richard followed her. She settled herself on his sofa and opened the book. "So, is it short for Doreen?" he asked. "What? Your name?" "No, it's just Dor." How do you spell it?" "Door, like something you walk through to go places." "Oh." He had to say something, so he said, "What kind of a name is Dor, then?" She looked at him with her odd-coloured eyes. She said, "My name?" And then she went back to her Jane Austen. Richard picked up the remote control, turned on the television. Then he changed the channel. Changed it again. Sighed. Changed it again. "So what are we waiting for?" Dor turned the page. She didn't look up. "A reply." "What kind of a reply?" Dor shrugged. "Oh, right." It occurred to him then that her skin was very pale. Now that some of the dirt and blood had been removed, he wondered if it was pale from illness or from loss of blood, or if she simply didn't get out much or was anemic. Maybe she'd been in prison, although she looked a bit young for that. Perhaps that big man had been telling the truth when he said that she was mad. "Listen, when those men came over..." "Men?" A flash of the opal-coloured eyes. "Krupp and Vandermar." She mused for a moment, then nodded. "I suppose you could call them men, yes. Yeah, 2 legs, 2 arms, a head each." Richard kept on going. "When they came in here before, where were you?" She licked her finger. She turned a page. "I was here. But..." He stopped talking out of words. There wasn't anywhere in the flat that she could have hidden herself. But she hadn't left the flat. But... There was a scratching noise, and a dark shape rather larger than a mouse scurried out from the mess of videotapes beneath the television. "Jesus," said Richard. He threw the remote control at it as hard as he could. It crashed into the videos with a bang. Of the dark shape there was no sign. "Richard," said Dor. "It's okay," he explained. I think it was a rat or something." She glared at him. Of course it was a rat. He'd have scared it now, poor thing. She looked round the room, then made a low whistling noise between her 2 front teeth. "Hello," she called. She knelt on the floor, with Mansfield Park abandoned. "Hello." She flashed a glance back at Richard. "If you've hurt it," she threatened, then softly to the room, "I'm sorry. He's an idiot. Hello." "I'm not an idiot," said Richard. "Shh," she said. "Hello." A pink nose and 2 small black eyes peeked out from under the sofa. The rest of the head followed, and it was scrutinised its surroundings suspiciously. It was indeed much too big to be a mouse. Richard was certain of that. "Hi," said Dor warmly. "Are you okay?" She extended her hand. The animal climbed into it and then ran up her arm, nestling in the crook of it. Dor stroked its side with her finger. It was dark brown with a long pink tail. There was something that looked like a folded piece of paper attached to its side. "It's a rat," said Richard, feeling that there were some times when a man could be forgiven for stating the obvious. "Yes, it is. And are you going to apologise?" "What? Apologise?" Maybe he hadn't heard her properly. Maybe he was the one who was going mad. To a rat? Dor said nothing, fairly meaningfully. "I'm sorry," said Richard to the rat with dignity, "if I startled you." The rat looked up at Dor. "No, he really does mean it," she said. "He's not just saying it." "So what have you got for me?" She fumbled at the rat's side, pulled out a much-folded piece of brown paper, which had been held on with something that looked to Richard rather like a vivid blue rubber band. She opened it up. A piece of ragged-edged brown paper with spidery black handwriting on it. She read it and nodded. "Thank you," she said to the rat. "I appreciate all that you've done." And it scampered onto the couch, glared up at Richard for a moment, and then was gone in the shadows. The girl called Dor passed the paper to Richard. "Here," she said. "Read this." It was late afternoon in central London, and with autumn drawing on, it was getting dark. Richard had taken the tube to Tottenham Court Road and was now walking west down Oxford Street, holding the piece of paper. Oxford Street was the retail hub of London, and even now the pavements were packed with shoppers and tourists. "It's a message," she said when she gave it to him, "from the Marquis de Carabas." Richard was sure he'd heard the name before. "That's nice," he said. "Out of postcards, was he? This is quicker." He passed the lights and the noise of the Virgin Megastore and the shop that sold tourist souvenir London police helmets and little red London buses, and the place next door that sold individual slices of pizza, and then turned right. "You have to try to follow the directions written on here. Try not to let anyone follow you." And then she sighed. She said, "I really shouldn't involve you this much." "If I follow these directions, will it speed up getting you out of here?" "Yes." He turned into Hanway Street, and while he'd taken only a few steps from the well-lit bustle of Oxford Street, he might as well have been in another city. Hanway Street was empty, forsaken. A narrow, dark road, little more than an alleyway, filled with gloomy record shops and closed restaurants, the only light spilling out from the secretive drinking clubs on the upper floors of the buildings. He walked along it, feeling apprehensive. Turn right into Hanway Street, left into Hanway Place, then right again into Orme Passage. Stop at the first street light you come to. "Are you sure this is right?" "Yes." He did not remember an Orme Passage, although he'd been to Hanway Place before. There was an underground Indian restaurant there, which Gary from work was quite fond of. As far as Richard could remember, Hanway Place was a dead end. The Mandeer, that was the restaurant. He passed their brightly lit front door, the restaurant steps leading invitingly down into the underground, and then he turned left. He'd been wrong. There was an Orme Passage. He could see the sign for it high up on the wall. Orme Passage, W1. No wonder he hadn't noticed it before. It was scarcely more than a narrow alleyway between houses, lit by a sputtering gas jet. You didn't see a lot of those anymore, thought Richard. He held his instructions to the gaslight, peering at them. "Then turn around thrice, Widdershins." "Widdershins is anti-clockwise, Richard." He turned 3 times, feeling stupid. "Look, why do I have to do all this just to see your friend? I mean, all this nonsense." "It's not nonsense, really. Just humour me on this, okay?" And she'd smiled at him. He stopped turning. He walked down to the alley to the very end. Nothing. No one. Just a metal dustbin, and beside it something that might have been a pile of rags. "Hello," called Richard. "Is anyone here? I'm Dor's friend. Hello?" No, there was no one here. Richard was rather relieved. Now he could go home, explain to the girl that nothing had happened, and then he'd call in the appropriate authorities. They'd sort it all out. He crumpled the paper into a tight ball, tossed it towards the bin. What Richard had taken for a pile of rags unfolded, expanded, and stood up in one fluid motion, and a hand caught the crumpled paper in mid-air. "Mine, I believe," said the Marquis de Carabas, who wore a huge, dandyish black coat that was not quite a frock coat, nor exactly a trench coat, and high black boots, and beneath his coat raggedy clothes. His eyes burned white in an extremely dark face, and he grinned, white teeth, momentarily, as if at a private joke of his own. He bowed to Richard. He said, "De Carabas at your service, and you are—" said Richard. "You are Richard Mayhew, the young man who rescued our wounded Dor. How is she now?" "She's okay. Her arm's still a bit—" "Her recovery time will undoubtedly astonish us all. Her family had remarkable recuperative powers. It's a wonder anyone managed to kill them at all, isn't it?" The man who called himself the Marquis de Carabas walked restlessly up and down the alley. Richard could already tell he was the sort of person who was always in motion like a great cat. "Someone killed Dor's family?" asked Richard. "We're not going to get very far if you keep repeating everything I say, now are we?" said the Marquis, who was now standing in front of Richard. "Sit down," he ordered. Richard looked around the alley for something to sit on. The Marquis put a hand on his shoulder and sent him sprawling to the cobblestones. "She knows I don't come cheap. What exactly is she offering me?" "Sorry?" "What is the deal? She sent you here to negotiate, young man. I'm not cheap, and I never give freebies." Richard shrugged, as well as he could shrug, from a supine position. "She said to tell you that she wants you to accompany her home, wherever that is, and to fix her up with a bodyguard." Even when the Marquis was at rest, his eyes never stopped moving, up, down, and around, as if he was looking for something, or thinking about something, and adding and subtracting and evaluating. Richard wondered whether the man was quite sane. "And she's offering me?" "Well, nothing." The Marquis blew on his fingernails and polished them on the lapel of his remarkable coat. Then he turned away. "She's offering me nothing." He sounded offended. Richard scrambled back up to his feet. "Well, she didn't say anything about money. She said she was going to have to owe you a favour." The eyes flashed. "Exactly what kind of favour?" "Really big one," said Richard. "She said she was going to have to owe you a really big favour." The Carabas grinned to himself like a hungry panther sighting a lost peasant child. Then he turned on Richard. "And you left her alone," he asked, "with Croup and Vandermar out there? Wait! Well, what are you waiting for?" He knelt down and he took a small metal object from a pocket, which he pushed into a manhole cover at the edge of the alley, and twisted. The manhole cover came up easily. The Marquis put away the metal object, took something out of a pocket that reminded Richard a little of a long firework or a flare. He held it in one hand, ran his other hand along it, and the far end erupted into scarlet flame. "Can I ask a question?" said Richard. "Certainly not," said the Marquis. "You don't ask any questions. You don't get any answers. You don't stray from the path. You don't even think about what's happening to you right now. Got it? But, most important of all, no buts. Now, we have a damsel to undistress," said de Carabas, "and time is of the essence. Move." He pointed into the depths revealed by the open manhole cover. Richard moved, clambering down the metal ladder set into the wall beneath the manhole, feeling so far out of his depth that he would have needed a bathyscope ever to see the surface again. Richard wondered where they were. This didn't seem to be a sewer. Perhaps it was a tunnel for telephone cables, or for very small trains, or for something else. He realised he didn't know very much about what went on beneath the streets of London. He walked nervously, worried that he'd catch his feet in something, or that he'd stumble in the darkness and break his ankle. De Carabas strode on ahead, nonchalantly, apparently uncaring of whether Richard was with him or not. The crimson flame cast huge shadows on the tunnel walls. Richard ran to catch up. "Let's see," said de Carabas. "I'll need to get her to the market. The next one's in 2 days' time, if I recall correctly, as of course I unfailingly do. I can hide her until then." "Market?" asked Richard. "The floating market, but you don't want to know about that. No more questions." Richard looked around. "Well, I was going to ask you where we are now, but I suppose you're going to refuse to tell me? The Marquis grinned once more. Very good, he said approvingly. You are in enough trouble already. You can say that again, sighed Richard. My fiancé's dumped me. I'll probably have to get a new telephone. Temple and Arch. Telephone is the least of your troubles. De Carabas put the flare down on the ground, resting it against the wall where it continued to sputter and flame. He began to climb some metal rungs set in the wall. Richard hesitated and followed him. The rungs were cold, rusted. He could feel them crumbling roughly against his hands as he climbed, fragments of rust getting in his eyes and mouth. The scarlet light from below was flickering, and then went out, and they climbed in total darkness. So, are we going back to Dor? He asked. Eventually. There's a little something I need to organise first. Insurance. And when we get into daylight, don't look down. Why not? Asked Richard. And then daylight hit his face, and he looked down. It was daylight. How was it daylight? A tiny voice asked in the back of his head. It had been almost night when he entered the alley. What, an hour ago? And he was holding onto a metal ladder that ran up the outside of a very high building, but a few seconds ago he was climbing the same ladder, and he'd been inside, hadn't he? And below him he could see London. Tiny cars, tiny buses and taxis, tiny buildings, trees, miniature lorries, tiny, tiny people. They swam in and out of focus beneath him. To say that Richard Mayhew was not very good at heights would be perfectly accurate, but it would fail to give the full picture. It would be like describing the planet Jupiter as bigger than a duck. Richard hated cliff tops and high buildings. Somewhere not far inside him was the fear, the stark, utter, silently screaming terror that if he got too close to the edge, then something would take over and he would find himself walking to the edge of a cliff top, and then he would just step off into space. It was as if he could not entirely trust himself. And he kept away. Oh no, and that scared Richard more than the simple fear of falling ever could. So he called it vertigo, and he hated it and himself, and he kept away from high places. Richard froze on the ladder, his hands clamped tightly to the rungs. His eyes hurt, somewhere behind the eyeballs. He started breathing too fast, too deeply. Somebody, said an amused voice above him, wasn't listening, was he? Richard's throat didn't work. He swallowed, moistening it. I can't move. His hands were sweating. What if they sweated so much that he simply slipped off into the void? Of course you can move, or if you don't, you can stay here, hanging onto the side of the wall till your hands freeze and your legs buckle, and you tumble to a messy death 1,000 feet below. Richard looked up at the Marquis. He was looking down at Richard, still smiling. When he saw that Richard was watching him, he let go of the rungs with both his hands and waggled his fingers at him. Richard felt a wave of sympathetic vertigo run through him. Bastard, he said under his breath. Then he let go of the rung with his right hand. He moved it up 8 inches till it found the next rung. Then he moved his right leg up 1 rung. And then he did it again, but with his left hand. And after a while he found himself at the edge of a flat roof, and he stepped over it and collapsed. He was aware that the Marquis was striding along the roof away from him. Richard felt the rooftop with his hands, felt the solid structure beneath him. His heart was pounding in his chest. A gruff voice, some distance away, shouted, "You're not wanted here, de Carabas. Get away! Clear off!" "Old Bailey," he heard de Carabas say, "you're looking wonderfully healthy." And then footsteps shuffled towards him, and a finger prodded him gently in the ribs. "You're right, laddie. I've got some stew cooking back there. You want some? It's starling." Richard opened his eyes. "No, thank you," he said. He saw the feathers first. He wasn't sure if it was a coat or a cape or some kind of strange covering that had no name, but whatever kind of outer garment it was covered thickly and entirely in feathers. A face, kind and creased with grey mutton chop whiskers, peered out from the top of the feathers. The body beneath the face, where it was not covered with feathers, was wound round and around with ropes. Richard found himself remembering a theatrical performance of Robinson Crusoe he'd been taken to as a child. This was what Robinson Crusoe might have looked like if he'd been shipwrecked on a rooftop instead of a desert island. "They called me Old Bailey, lad," said Robinson Crusoe man. He fumbled at a battered pair of glasses on a string around his neck. He pulled them on, staring through them at Richard. I don't recognise you. What barony do you give fealty to? What's your name? Richard pulled himself into a sitting position. They were on the roof of an old building built of brown stone with a tower above them. Withered gargoyles, missing wings and limbs, and in a couple of places even heads, jutted sadly from the corners of the tower. From far below he could hear the wail of a police siren and the muted roar of traffic. Across the rooftop, in the shadow of the tower, there was something that looked like a tent, an old brown tent, much mended, speckled white with bird shit. He opened his mouth to tell the old man his name. You shut up, said the Marquis de Carabas. Don't say another word. Then he had turned to old Bailey. People who put their noses where they aren't wanted sometimes, snapped his fingers loudly beneath the old man's nose, making him jump and lose them. Now you've owed me a favour in 20 years, old Bailey, a big favour, and I'm calling it in. The old man blinked. Oh, I was a fool, he said quietly. No fool like an old fool, agreed the Marquis, and he reached a hand into an outside pocket of his coat, pulled out a silver box, larger than a snuff box, smaller than a cigar box, a good deal more ornate than either. Do you know what this is? I wish I didn't. You'll keep it safe for me. I don't want it. You don't have any choice, said the Marquis. This old roof man took the silver box from him and held it awkwardly in both hands as if it was something that might explode at any moment. The Marquis prodded Richard gently with his square-toed black boot. Right, he said, we'd better get a move on, hadn't we? And he strode off across the roof. Richard got to his feet, followed, keeping well away from the side of the building. The Marquis opened a door into the side of the tower, beside a high cluster of chimneys, and they went down a poorly lit spiral staircase. Who was that man? Asked Richard, peering against the dim light. Their footsteps echoed and reverberated down the metal stairs. The Marquis de Carabas snorted. You haven't heard a word I've said, have you? Well, you're in trouble already. Everything you do, everything you say, everything you hear just makes it worse. You had better pray that you haven't stepped in too far. Richard put his head on his side. Excuse me, he said. I know this is a personal question, but are you clinically insane? Possible, but very unlikely. Why? Well, said Richard, one of us must be. It was now completely dark, and Richard stumbled slightly as he reached the last of the steps, found himself looking for a step that wasn't there. Mind your head, said the Marquis, and he opened a door. Richard banged his forehead into something hard, said, ow, stepped out through a low door, shielding his eyes against the light. Richard rubbed his forehead and then rubbed his eyes. The door they'd just come through was the door to the broom cupboard in the stairwell of an apartment building. It was filled with brooms and dusters and an elderly mop, high variety of cleaning fluids and powders and waxes. Had no stairs at the back of it that he could see, just a wall, on which a stained old calendar hung quite uselessly, unless 1979 was about to come round again. The Marquis was examining the Have You Seen This Girl poster stuck beside Richard's front door. Not her best side, he said. Richard shut the door to the broom cupboard. He took his keys from his back pocket and unlocked the front door, and he was home. He was rather relieved to see, through his kitchen windows, night time once more. Richard, said Dor, you did it. She'd washed herself while he was gone, and her layers of clothes looked like she'd at least made an effort to get the worst of the filth and the blood off them. The grime was gone from her face and hands, and her hair, when washed, was a dark shade of auburn with copper and bronze highlights. Richard wondered how old she was. 15? 16? Older? He still couldn't tell. She had put on the brown leather jacket she'd been wearing when he'd found her, huge, enveloping like an old flying jacket, which somehow made her look smaller than she was, even more vulnerable. Well, yes, said Richard. The Marquis de Carabas went down on one knee to the girl, and he lowered his head. My lady, he said. She seemed uncomfortable. Oh, do get up to Carabas. I'm pleased you came. He stood up in one smooth movement. "I understand," he said, "that the words fever, really, and big have been used in conjunction and in the right order." Later, she walked over to Richard. She took his hands in hers. "Richard, thanks. I really appreciate everything you've done. I changed the sheets on the bed, and I wish there was something I could do to pay you back. You're leaving?" She nodded. "I'll be safe now. More or less, I hope. For a little while." "Where are you going now?" She smiled gently. She shook her head. "Oh, no, I'm out of your life. And you've been wonderful." She went up on tiptoes and kissed him on the cheek as friends kiss friends. "If I ever need to get in touch with you, you don't. Ever." And then she paused. "Look, I'm sorry, okay?" Richard inspected his feet in an awkward sort of a way. "There's nothing to be sorry about," he said, and added doubtfully, "It was fun." Then he looked up again, and there was nobody there. And that is the end of chapter 2, my friends. And when I get half an hour another day, I shall read you chapter 3. No guarantees from me, but I hope you, if you are watching, leave a comment so that I know you're watching and that you want me to read you chapter 3. And if nobody does, I maybe don't have a lot of time. But it's been wonderful spending this evening reading to you. Cheers to you wherever you are. And see you for chapter 3, let's hope, sometime soon.